Hey, welcome back everybody. Today we are going to get into the long block assembly of the 440. If you remember, probably about 8 months ago or so, we started the 440 Chrysler build. Well, I finally gotten back to it. I got distracted with all kinds of other stuff. But I shot a bunch of video of the upper end cylinder head rebuild and so forth, and we got this thing buttoned up. And so this is going to be the next segment of the 440 build. I hope you enjoy it. Here we go. So we've talked about these cylinder heads before. What we did is we set this up in our seat and guide machine, and the factory big block Chrysler heads and a lot of these cast iron heads have an integral or integrated guide. That means that the valve guide itself is literally part of this head. What we have to do is we have to bore that out if it's worn out, and we press in a hardened steel insert. We've done that. We put guides in all of these, and also a lot of times you have to put a hardened seat insert here on the exhaust side because of unleaded fuel. Fortunately, this particular Chrysler casting, what they do is they induction harden the seat here at the factory. So they heat treat this area. So you've already got a hardened seat that works well with unleaded fuel. And then of course you ream your guides, and that now you've got a really good basis for your valves. You have the correct clearances here. You're not going to have any blow by or anything. So we've got the guides in. We're also going to cut the seats here, and we milled the cylinder heads. I think there was a shot of that in an earlier video. And basically, we're also going to trim the guides off of the top. And once we get that done and get the rest of the machine work done, it's basically we're going to be assembling these heads. All right, guys, so now we've gotten to the point where I did a little bit of stuff off camera. I went ahead and cut the seats so all the seats are matched. We seated in the valves, lapped in the valves, and you can see all the new guides are in, all the seats are cut and prepped, heads are milled. We got our valves prepped, reground, and the stems cut. And then of course we got a new set of valve springs here that we purchased. So the next step is basically just putting these heads together, and then we got to get them on the engine. Also, one important aspect to remember if you happen to assemble your cylinder heads, always make sure you use some kind of lubricant on here. I use assembly lube, moly graphite. You can use engine oil. You just don't ever want to put these valves in dry once you go to assemble your head. Make sure there's some type of lube on there. That's pretty critical. Otherwise you get a dry start. So a couple more things about these cylinder heads, you guys. This is pretty much a machine shop type operation, what I'm going to explain to you now, but it's something that you need to be aware of. You really can't just slap these heads together. We have something called spring installed height, and if you see, we took one of our retainers off. We have a gauge called the spring installed height gauge. Go figure. I've talked about this before. What this does is it takes the place of the valve spring, and you can see I've got my retainer and my keepers here that are going to go with this valve, and we measure the height where the spring is going to sit. That height is critical to get the correct spring tension for opening and closing pressures. On these heads, they turned out really good. We actually didn't have to put any shims under them because the heights are right where they need to be, because the seats are in good shape and the valves are in good shape. The other thing is the tip height. So the tip height is from the stem tip here to the spring pad. We have to measure that distance after we do the valve job, because this is a non-adjustable valve train. So it has a rocker shaft that sits here, and the rocker shaft bolts down. There's no adjustment on the rocker. Now they do have adjustable rockers you can put on these big block Chryslers, but we're using the stock rockers. So what you have to do is you have to take a depth gauge also, and you have to measure the height of that valve, every one of them, and you have to make sure that they're within spec. After you do the valve job, you cut the seats and valves, it can raise these stems a little bit. And so we have a fixture on our grinder. Once we grind the valves, we also shave the tips off here if they end up being a little bit too tall. But like I said, that's machine shop stuff, so just make sure the machine shop is checking your spring installed height and also your valve tip height across the top on these big block Chryslers. These are really critical measurements, and I've seen situations where the valve heights were too tall here because whoever did the heads was careless and didn't pay attention to it. And when you bolt the rocker shaft down, it holds the valves open and the cylinder has no compression. That's a thing with these heads. So that tip height and also that spring installed height, very critical on this head. All right, so now we've got all that taken care of. We measured all the heights, they're correct, and we can start assembling these cylinder heads. So there's a couple of different type of spring compressors. We're going to use the pneumatic one. And once you get this, of course, you want to put your valve stem seals on here. We've got all the seals on. And also on your keepers, don't put used keepers on, guys. I mean, really, seriously, buy new valve keepers. These are all brand new hardened keepers. You take the old ones and throw them in the trash. And we also got brand new valve springs for this. I wouldn't recommend putting used valve springs on either. So we're just going to take our compressor and we're going to use it to compress the spring and basically get your valve keepers in there, and that's pretty much it. Once you get all of the springs on, we'll do another one here. Once you get all of those valve springs on, you want to take a soft hammer and lightly tap the valve tips just to make sure all these keepers are seated, because if one of these keepers is not quite seated in here and it pops out when the engine's running, you're going to have problems. So once you get all those on, I won't bother showing you how to put all of them on, we'll do it off camera, but once you get those on, you want to take a soft hammer and you want to give a good smack. Don't use a steel hammer for this, make sure it's soft. And what that does is that ensures by hitting the valve tip that the keepers are locked into place and they're not going to pop out when you get this thing on the engine, which would be very bad. All right, folks, so the 440 heads are done. That's pretty much it. We're going to get back over to the block. We're going to take these back over to the assembly area now, set up the camera over there, and the next step is to actually install the cylinder heads on the engine and then button this 440 up. So we'll get over there and get going on that. Okay guys, so the next step is to get the cylinder heads onto our block here. You always want to make sure that the surface is really clean here, and this thing's been thoroughly cleaned. If you need to have the block decked or resurfaced, this block was nice and flat, so we didn't feel like that was necessary. And then of course you want to take a good quality gasket. There's a couple of dowel pins here in the front and the back that are going to locate this gasket. And that dowel pin goes right inside that hole, that provision for it. So just get your gasket on there. Now you can copper coat these if you want in some cases. Felpro actually doesn't recommend using any kind of sealer on these. I never do, and I've never had any issues. So once you get to that point, get your gasket on there, and then it's just a matter of setting the head on there and getting the bolts in and torquing them. Some engines have bolt holes that go into the water jacket. On this particular Chrysler, they do not. So we don't, like if you're doing a Chevrolet big or small block, you got to seal the threads. On the Chrysler you don't, because none of these bolt holes go into the cooling system. So then we just take our cylinder head and you just very carefully set that cylinder onto those dowels. You can set it down momentarily if you need to reposition it, that's fine. So we want to look at your bolt holes, and your bolt holes will kind of guide you, and there we go, right on our dowel pins. Now, make sure you remember, even though it's on there, it's not bolted down. You don't want to tip the motor at this point, and we want to get our bolts in it before we do anything like that. Okay guys, so we've got our bolts in now. On the 440 383 style engine, we have short bolts on the outer perimeter here. We've got 8 short bolts here, We've got 5 of the long bolts that go in the center, and then up here inside the lifter valley there's 4 more of the short bolts. These inner bolts are the same length as the outer ones. And then once you get them on, now we've got all these bolts in and snug down. They're just finger tight though, or hand tight. Now we need to torque them in sequence. It's very important that you do this in sequence, and I also like to do it in either 2 or 3 steps. I won't go to full torque. I will go a third of the torque and then another third and then full torque on the third pass. And you want to do all those in sequence. It's important because you want to pull this head down evenly. You don't want to have any kind of distortion or any problems as far as getting that head gasket to seal. So I've got the torque sequence here, and I'll try to give you a good shot of it there. If you need to, you can pause the video and look at that, but you can also download this offline at a lot of different websites. So that's the torque sequence. I've already got the first 2 steps done. I've got them torqued to 50 pounds now. I want 35 and then 50. And the final torque on this is going to be 70. Your total torque is 70 pounds. So I'm just going to take my torque sequence right there, and I'm going to final torque this in sequence. Number 1 starts in the middle here. And we're going to torque it to 70. And then number 2, we come just down just to the other side. And then 3, we're going to come back up here to this one. So you just want to follow that torque sequence. 4 comes back down on the other side. And then of course 5 is going to be up here. So what we're doing is we're starting in the center and kind of working in a circular pattern. That's pretty much the way most torque specs go. And so we just continue on through all of this sequence, and once we're done, we're good to go. So 6 comes back over here. Seven is up here, down here. 8 comes back over here. 9 comes up here. And then we go to 10. 10's going to come back down here. This next bolt on the outer, it's this one actually. 10 comes back down here to the bolt on the outer. 11 is up here. 12 comes back down here. 13 comes to the inner bolt here. And then for 14, it's going to cross back over to the back of the motor down here. 15 comes up to the end bolt in the middle. And then 16 is going to crisscross back over down here to this side. And then of course 17 is here, and that is your final head bolt. Now, it's just really important that you follow the torque sequence. Another thing I would recommend after you do that whole sequence, leave your torque wrench at full torque and go over every one of these to make sure you didn't miss anything. Pretty sure we didn't, but you always want to double check. There's 17 head bolts on this, and I always count in my head as I'm doing these to make sure I didn't miss any. Come in here and make sure you double check your inner ones. All right, we got them all, and that's it. Your cylinder head is torqued on. I'm not going to put the other head installation on camera because it's exactly the same situation as this. But I do want to show you some of the valve train setup here. Next step is you want to get your lifters in. Now, there's a couple of things that you really need to make sure you don't do here. This is moly graphite assembly lube, and for flat tap lifters, as most of you know, making sure that they're lubricated correctly is a big deal. So we have moly graphite on the cam. We also want to take moly graphite and put it on the bottom of the lifter only. Now notice I said the bottom of the lifter only. That's critical. Mainly because the flat tappet lifters, they have to rotate in their bore. And so you don't want to get any thick assembly lube on the body of the lifter here. What we want to do is just take a light, thin coating of oil. It doesn't have to get crazy. You don't have to get crazy with it. But I'll usually just take some high zinc oil and you just want it enough on there so it doesn't go in dry. But you really don't want any of that assembly lube on the lifter body here, mainly because that could stop it from rotating, and if one of these doesn't rotate like it's supposed to, you're going to be in real trouble. So then you just take your lifter, and we're just going to put that down in the bore. Now it should go into the bore real nice. It shouldn't go in hard. It shouldn't bind or anything. If it does, you got a problem, because remember, these have to rotate. So these bores, when we do these blocks, we usually run a hone through these bores to make sure that we don't have any issues with that. And then of course we clean the block. So again, just a very small dab of assembly lube on the bottom. Man, my neighbor's dog needs to be trained. That stupid nut. And then of course on the lifter body itself here, and very easily down into the bore. I'll get all these in. I'll come back and then we'll talk about the rest of this valve train. Okay, so we've got our lifters in with the lube on the bottom and the oil on the body. Now we want to get our push rods in. The Chrysler engines do not have hollow push rods. They actually oil up through one of these pedestal mounts. In fact, it's this one here. And so we've got our rocker assembly here, and we want to put our rocker assembly on. So one thing that is notable here is this. Chrysler rocker shaft has this, it's a shaft system, it has these spacers on it. It's really important, you guys, that you get these spacers in the wrong spot. And I mean, usually we're going to leave these in order. So there's a small spacer on the end, and then the second position here, there's a wider spacer. The middle is also a small spacer, and then the second position from this end is also a wide spacer, and then so the two wide spacers are going to go in the second position from the end. If you get those mixed up, the valve train is going to clatter like there's no tomorrow. Don't ask me how I know that, but let's just say there's no substitute for experience. So we want to get our push rods in, and then we're going to go ahead and put our rocker shaft on. Now I recommend when you put the push rods in that you put a little bit of oil on the lifter side. And then you're just going to go, these rockers are just or these push rods are going to kind of lay here because you got a lot of slop here till you get this rocker on. So we just want to get some lube on the end of these that are going to go in. You don't want to put assembly lube really per se in the body of that lifter. We just want oil there. And then we're just going to kind of run these down and just let them sit. And like I said, they'll fall over like that. That's just, there's nothing you can do about it. There's no guides or anything in these heads for these push rods. The rocker shaft is what aligns them. So, but you want to get all your push rods in where they go. And once you get all 8 of them in on this side, then we can take our rocker shaft and put it on. Now, the rocker shaft is a little bit tricky on this. You kind of got to finagle these push rods around. So what I do is I make sure I get all the rockers facing the right way, which is not always that easy to do here. Bring your rockers over, and you just want to get your bolts and set your bolts in the holes that they go in, just like that. Up here, we want just a little blob of assembly lube on top of each push rod. You know, we don't want any of this stuff dry. We've already actually lubricated we took this rocker shaft apart. When we put it together, we put plenty of oil and stuff on it, so it's lubricated. But just go ahead and get just a little blob of assembly lube on top of each one of those rockers. And that just assures that you don't have any kind of a dry start or anything on this baby. And then of course we're going to take take your rockers and kind of just try to push them down on that push rod so that push rod is lined up with that rocker. Let's get it right under there. And then you can start evenly torquing your bolts down. Now you want to run these bolts down. Just start running these in evenly. And also while you're doing this, you want to make sure that your push rods stay in place. Sometimes one of those will pop out of there, and that can cause you a problem here. So we want to just run the bolts down here in an even fashion. And once we get it to the point where we're sure that the rocker shaft is down far enough that those push rods aren't going to come out of there, then we can start snugging this thing down with our tool. Okay, so that's pretty good. I don't think any of those are going to come out. So we're just going to take now there is a torque spec on these, but I'm just going to snug it up for now. I'm not going to really torque these, but you want to run these down evenly, guys. You don't want to pull this shaft down on one side here and kind of tweak that shaft. You want to kind of alternate back and forth and pull it down slowly. If you have a speed handle, it actually works really good for this. So I'm just going to start pulling this down, and I'm going to alternate between all these bolts and make sure that this shaft goes down evenly all the way across. Now this is a non-adjustable valve train, so it's once you torque the rocker shaft down, that's pretty much it. And you definitely don't want to over torque these. The torque is not very much on this rocker shaft. So I've got all these bolts pretty much snug down, just a little more than hand tight here. Okay, so you want to start in the middle, and you see that's it. It's not torqued, and then you want to work your way to the outsides. Go back to this end, and that's it. You don't really want to torque those any more than that. I've seen guys snap these off before, so and then just go double check that every one of them is torqued at 25, and that's basically it. Now, the one thing that I would encourage you to do, since it's a non-adjustable valve train, you want to make sure you don't have any up and down play here as far as this being loose and clattering, and you also want to be able to push that down. Hopefully you can see that. I'll zoom in on this a little bit. If you look right here, you can see that I'm in the plunger, right? I'm not bottomed out. I'm in the plunger of that push rod, but I'm not loose. And that's the way they all should be. Now you might have to rotate the motor. Like this lifter over here is open. You'll have to rotate the motor to close that valve, because right now that's going to be tight. But we're gonna check them all and make sure that we don't have any loose rockers, and that we are in the travel of that plunger, and everything looks really good on this. And that's basically rocker shaft installation for your 440. So I'm going to get the other head on, get the other side of the valve train on, and then we will move on. Okay everybody, so we've got the heads on, and all of the rockers and everything are torqued down, and we're in the travel of our plunger here. We don't have any loose push rods. I talked earlier about the fact that the stem height on the valve stems is pretty critical to make sure that this push rod is in the correct range. So when the valve or the lifter is on the base circle down here, you can see that we're in the plunger of that lifter. You can see that plunger moving up and down, but we don't have, this is not loose. So the push rod's being held between the rocker arm and the spring-loaded plunger, but I still have room for that plunger to pump up. And that's the way that you want your valve train on this thing. It is non-adjustable. So that pretty much does it for the top end, and of course we have the valley pan and the intake and all that stuff. We actually have quite a bit left to do. We don't have the oil pan. Sometimes we do the oil pan and the oil pump and the front cover first, and then we put the heads on. In this case, we didn't have all the parts we needed, so we went ahead and put the heads on. It doesn't really matter if you put the heads on first or button up the bottom end first. You can do it either way. So in the next video, we're getting pretty close here to finishing this thing up, but like I said, there's still quite a bit of work. So in the next video, we will we'll get the oil pan and the bottom end and the front cover and all that stuff buttoned up. There's actually quite a bit to it. So in the next video, we will get the lower end, the oil pan, the oil pump onto the block and button up the bottom end. I think I'm gonna cut this video off here because it's getting to the 30-minute mark. What I've found is if I go longer than that, people lose interest. So I really appreciate you guys watching, and hopefully this was enlightening for you. We are on track to do a bunch of other stuff here. So I hope you like this video and you subscribe, and also keep in mind that the S10 build is going to be progressing. It is pouring down rain here this week, so there's nothing happening outside. It's all indoors. But I do appreciate you watching, and I will talk to you very soon, I promise. So stay tuned. There will be the tail end of buttoning this thing up is coming soon. Thanks a lot.